Good evening, everyone. I'm Divya Alvira. So, as she kindly introduced me, today's session we are going to talk about the nutrition in our common GI disorders. Of course, GI disorders is a very vast topic, and we may not cover all the aspects, but mainly today we would be first talking about the management of IBS through a low FODMAP diet. We would be reviewing GERD, the dietary triggers in GERD. We would also be throwing light on the use of probiotics in gut health, and we might review some dietary guidelines for liver disease. So, talking about GI disorders, of course, nutrition plays a very fundamental component. In most of the GI disorders, we see that the intake is often inadequate. Many a times there's malabsorption due to the pathophysiology of the disease. A lot of times the nutrients are maybe adequately taken, but the body might not process them in the right order. So there will be different symptoms and different etiologies, but the crux of it all, the nutritional management becomes fundamental. And with any pharmacotherapy related to GI disorders, we cannot eliminate the role of nutrition. So it serves as a very fundamental component, and it is also a therapeutic tool in all the functional disorders like IBS, IBD. In most of the cases, the modification of diet, as like in GERD or reflux, is in itself the solution to the disease. So today we'll be throwing light on these dietary aspects. Talking about the key roles, the way nutrition works in management of GI disorders is through a few important functions. The first one would be symptomatic management. Like we see in most of the functional GI disorders, patients would walk into the OPD with primary symptoms like often they have bloating. There's a lot of gas production. There would be pain. There would be spasms, and most of these cases, just by dietary modification and maybe like a short-term pharmacointervention, the symptomatic management is well maintained. Another thing, what happens is there is a lot of inflammation in most of the functional disorders. So, a balanced diet with good anti inflammatory properties, it will definitely help in reducing or at least managing the chronic inflammations. And once the dietary triggers are controlled, the inflammation would rather um, get controlled with the diet as opposed to giving a lot of painkillers or other medications. Gut microbiome modulation. Now, most of the times, the bad microbiome or the bad gut flora is the actual reason for these symptoms to arise. A lot of time, there's a lot of indigestion or there is increased gut sensitivity, which is caused mainly due to the poor microbiome, and hence, with proper nutrition, proper probiotic, the gut microbiome is altered. And the last, but definitely not the least, is preventing malnutrition. A lot of these diseases have a very big impact on the patient's nutritional status. There might be chronic functional disorders, there might be acute disorders, but in most of the cases, we see that the intake is reduced or it may be adequate but not balanced. Hence, nutrition would play an important role in specializing these diets as per the patient's requirement. So, moving on to our very first topic would be IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. As we all know, it's a functional gastro disorder. This has an impact of around 11% of the population globally is suffering, and it typically might show as simple symptoms like pain, bloating, gassiness, which most of the patients are facing on day to day life but are not properly diagnosed. It definitely affects the quality of life significantly. Here, the diet would play a major role in symptom modulation rather than the elimination of the disorder. Every patient has a unique symptom or a unique experience with their disorder. Some may have acute symptoms, some may have chronic symptoms. These also change over the time as per the patient's condition, or it might change as per the diet modulation. and hence it needs a very personalized approach which changes from time to time. Also, the nutrition approach, mainly in IBS, is personalized because not every IBS is of the same type. People might be suffering from different types of IBS, which is one is the IBS-C, which is constipation dominant. Here, the nutrition would change in terms of the type of fiber which is provided. Definitely, the liquid volumes, hydration volumes would change. In IBSD, which is diarrhea predominant, they cannot be put on a lot of insoluble fibers. There will be a change in the pharmacotherapy for these patients. The type of diet needs to be low residue in IBSD. IBSM, again, the diet varies because it cannot be a consistent diet for a longer period of time. Depending on the symptoms, these patients will need to be educated how to correlate their diet and their symptoms. So they will have to be educated on making the modification as per their own symptoms. And a lot of these, a large chunk of these patients go into an unclassified category where the symptoms are not consistent for them to fit into a particular subtype. Here, we use an approach of a low FODMAP over a period of time. Since this is a very multifactorial etiology, here there will be either disorders related to the gut brain axis. So, hence, when there is more stress or infection, the trigger of the disease and more flare up is seen. It could sometimes be just due to visceral hypersensitivity. Many a times, as we discussed, the microbiome is poor, and that could cause a lot of symptom flare up. These could be antibiotic related, these could be injury related. There could be altered gut motility, which could be secondary to another disorder. But all of these causes, individually or together, require a multifactorial management as well. So, IBS is not something which can only be taken care of with pharmacotherapy, which can only be resolved through diet. There needs to be a combined effort, mainly pharmacotherapy for management of symptoms. Psychotherapy is very important for the gut brain axis management. Every time there is a trigger, the gut brain axis will be triggered and the symptoms will flare up. And dietary management would also be composed of different approaches because not every diet will be suitable. So sometimes, most of the times, low FODMAP is the right approach, but a lot of patients benefit from different diets. Like there would be gluten-free diet, keto, there would be low carb, low fiber diet. Most of these patients are put on probiotic supplements, also probiotic, prebiotic, symbiotic. We will go deeper into depth to understand the dietary part of it. Of course, pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy plays its own role. Now, when we are talking about the management, I would put a lot more stress on the diet part of it. In the diet, low FODMAP is something which is evidently proven to reduce the IBS symptoms. Most of the times, the triggers like caffeine, fat, alcohol, spicy foods, fluid intake, etc., are modified. There will be a lot of exclusion diets used. So, in these exclusion diets, most of the foods that are causing the triggers are identified and eliminated and slowly reintroduced. We are talking a lot about the impact of low FODMAP in IBS patients. So, understanding what FODMAP means is also a crucial part. Most of the studies are being done, and they have said that nutrition management is the primary treatment in the patients where IBS symptoms are flared up due to a FODMAP rich diet. Now, FODMAPs are nothing but these are the fermentable carbohydrates. When these are taken in larger quantity, they cause osmotic diarrhea because they increase the water content in the intestines and they do not get absorbed easily. Now, these poorly absorbed carbohydrates would move undigested into the colon. Hence, the microbiome would ferment it and it would result in more gas production in the colon. There would be luminal distension. And in patients who already have an underlying visceral hypersensitivity, it will cause pain, discomfort, bloating, and all the other symptoms. So hence, using an approach where we are eliminating these FODMAPs or a low FODMAP diet, it shows a symptomatic benefit in patients from as high as 50 to 86%. And in many of patients, we have also seen studies that prove gluten-free diets are attributed for symptomatic benefit. But the reasoning behind it could be that gluten is nothing but a fructan, and fructan is also a FODMAP. So overall, every gluten-free diet will also be a low FODMAP diet. Okay. So understanding more about what the FODMAPs are, as we have discussed that these are nothing but short chain carbs which are poorly absorbed in the intestine. The F stands for the fermentable sugars, which gets fermented as they move into the colon. O is the oligosaccharides, which are usually found in grains like wheat, rye, and certain vegetables which are like onion, garlic, or beans. These are the type of carbohydrates which will produce a lot of fermentation. Disaccharides, which is usually found in dairy products. So any product which has lactose, either milk or other dairy, would produce similar effects. M is monosaccharides, which is usually in products with high fructose. So it could either be in overripe fruits or fruits with high fructose content, or in certain processed foods like there is corn syrup or fructose syrup, honey. These are all processed and have higher fructose content. And polyol sweeteners. So a lot of these artificial sweeteners would have either sorbitol or mannitol, certain chewing gums, or a lot of food with sweeteners has such effects. So many times consuming these foods would also give similar effects. In general, to give you an overview, of course, the list is extensive, but fruits with excess of fructose, mainly apple or mango, pear, watermelon, the sweetener, high fructose corn syrups, certain vegetables with high fructose contents, lactose products, as we discussed, galactons, which are usually found in beans, legumes. So, mainly a lot of plant based and vegetarian diet comes under that, and polyols, as we discussed, which again is in the sweeteners and certain fruits. There are a lot of fruits and vegetables which also have low FODMAP content. So accordingly, these lists are derived from the guidelines and certain bodies which divide the foods into low, high, and moderate groups, giving you an example of FODMAP food charts which are readily available. So today's session, we are focusing a lot more on the practical and clinical aspect of it. So what we can use in day-to-day practice are these FODMAP charts, which are available from a lot of evidence-based bodies. Usually these help patients because it gives them an overview understanding of the FODMAP content in the foods. So as per their intake, as per their regional food availability, these FODMAP charts can be made available. These tools become very user friendly even for the practitioner and for the patient. The elimination diet experiment, which we use for FODMAP, is going to require these FODMAP charts because it identifies the triggers which are usually sensitive to the gut, and hence we normally advise patients not to eat this, not to eat that. There will be a lot of information available on the high FODMAP diet, but with these charts having the low risk FODMAP ingredients, it is easier to tell the patients what they can have instead of what they need to omit. Okay. So this low FODMAP diet is usually taken down into three phases. When patient visits the OPD and we decide that there might be a potential benefit from the FODMAP diet, we put them into an elimination phase, which usually lasts either from 2 to 6 weeks. Here, all the high FODMAP foods are restricted. We do not give a lot of allowance in the initial phase of this diet. So what happens in the first phase? We take down the patient recall. You can understand the intake. You can understand the kind of FODMAPs the patient might be consuming. The list is given out, and as per guidelines, The high and the moderate FODMAP foods are all swapped for low FODMAP alternatives. Here, the diet would be little restrictive. However, they can be educated on the low FODMAP diets and foods which are available. This helps in identifying if the patient has had any symptom relief with a FODMAP diet. And in the second phase, once they come back for a follow up, we start and we reintroduce certain foods. Now, the second phase where the reintroduction is happening, usually some of the FODMAP subgroups which are very high will still not be introduced, but the moderate subgroups can slowly be challenged and be introduced. However, not all the food groups will be introduced together. So the reintroduction part could be of one subgroup or one food item at a time, and that will be taken over a period of 2 to 3 days. So that helps identify the symptoms and correlate it with the food items which are being reintroduced. And phase 3, which is personalization. By end of 6 to 8 weeks, most of the patients are done with the reintroduction, and they have a concise list of which foods suit them, which do not suit them. At least 80 to 85% of the patients are comfortable with the low FODMAP foods. Within the moderate and the high FODMAP foods, whichever suits them can be given in a smaller quantity over a period of time. And the high FODMAP foods which are not suiting to them can be eliminated for a long term period. Here, the personalization helps them to liberalize their restrictions. So their diet is not very restrictive and their quality of life will also improve. It expands the diet, so naturally their nutritional profile gets better. We do not need to worry about supplementing too much. We do not need to worry about the fiber content in the diet. And hence, it is very much recommended that they work with a healthcare professional or a registered dietitian through the process, so that the identification and the introduction part is very much in the safe ranges. So, talking about the low FODMAP, the main practical applications in day-to-day practice, these points need to be remembered that the baseline assessment is very important. We cannot eliminate FODMAPs or we cannot change FODMAPs without knowing what has been the baseline diet of the patient. If the patient is not consuming that food in the first place, the entire process is of no use. Patients need to be educated about the food swaps, because a lot of times, because of the fear of the symptoms or due to their own education, they might completely eliminate everything on the list, and this leads to patients coming back with a lot of malnutrition or a lot of deficiencies, especially B vitamins, or they come back with extreme constipation because most of the fiber rich foods are removed from the diet. We also encourage label reading in such patients, because a lot of these high FODMAP foods, as we discussed, were in the processed foods. Certain ingredients, as we discussed, like sorbitol, mannitol, or the fructose syrups, are used in day to day processed foods in the markets. So, label reading is important. Diary maintenance is important because this lasts up to 8 to 12 weeks, and not necessarily the patients might be able to recollect their correlation with the symptom and food. So, we usually suggest that patients maintain a diary for the symptoms and food intake. And the food reintroduction needs to be gradual. We cannot reintroduce all foods at a time. At the same time, we explain them the limitation and risk of the low FODMAP approach, because there might be long-term nutritional deficiencies if it's not followed correctly. Definitely, the fiber intake is reduced for the given time, and the modulation for that will be required. Gut microbiota might change depending on the change of ingredients, and strict supervision is required, which is a non-negotiable during this approach. Okay, moving on to the next topic, we'll be discussing GERD and the dietary triggers. GERD, as we all know, the gastroesophageal reflux disease. It's usually a long-term and chronic condition which has mild symptoms which worsen over time. What happens is the stomach acid usually comes up into the esophagus, giving symptoms of either regurgitation, heartburn. Sometimes it might give dysphagia-like symptoms. It is mainly caused due to lower esophageal sphincter dysfunction. Sometimes there could be delayed gastric emptying leading to more of acid production. There are certain dietary foods which increase the acid production and it gives reflux like symptoms. Or sometimes in patients like obesity or certain other disorders or with ascites, there is increased intra-abdominal pressure. And that leads to the pushing of the acid into the esophagus. Most of the dietary foods which trigger have two or three mechanisms which lead to them worsening of the GERD. Either the foods are in itself increasing the acid secretion, or they are limiting the gastric emptying. So these are the primary two causes where food might worsen the GERD symptoms. Or a lot of times it reduces the LES pressure, which is holding the acid in the stomach. A lot of times we focus a lot on eliminating the food, changing the diets, removing certain foods, giving a lot of antacids or alkaline based diets, but still patients don't come up with a good symptom benefit, or it might be acute and it keeps reoccurring. In such cases, it's important that we also identify the eating habits and not just the foods. So, a lot of times, due to corporate work structure or due to just the sedentary lifestyles, there might be reduced function or large meals while sitting at long hours. Overeating or overfilling the stomach again will increase the pressure and it will definitely cause the LES dysfunction. Many a times eating too late or late at night or lying down immediately after the meals, it will let the acid flow back up. A lot of times eating very quickly again will cause more of the pressure. So these are some of the eating habits which also act as triggers along with the food that is consumed. Talking about the common triggers in food, the first one would be definitely high fat or deep fried processed food items. A lot of times we've seen people with a lot of high fat dairy consumption come up with the symptoms. Many a times red meats or fried meats give the symptoms too quickly. Spicy food, constant exposure to spices, red chili powders, hot peppers, these irritate the esophageal lining and would cause symptomatic flare ups. A lot of citrus fruits or vegetables, tomatoes, usually not so much in the raw form, but processed ketchups or sauces, gives excess symptoms of GERD. Caffeine and chocolate are evidently known to increase the acid production in the body. Most of the sodas or energy drinks also have a high amount of caffeine. So, a lot of times, just in a vague exposure, whenever there's a reflux, people end up having soda to get symptom relief, but again, which causes a long term caffeine induction and it worsens the symptoms in the long run. Peppermint or spearmint consumption would definitely be a trigger. And certain alliums like garlic or onion, they relax the LES and hence it causes the acid reflux. Alcohol, carbonated beverages, again, are triggers for the GERD. Certain foods which do help in reduction of the reflux like symptoms would be some whole grains, oats, brown rice. They are known to have good fiber content. Again, another vegetables, leafy vegetables or alkaline vegetables like cucumber, zucchini are helpful. In fruits, we avoid the citrus fruits, but we go more on the alkaline based fruits, so bananas, melons, papayas. Most of the times, because we eliminate the fatty foods or the fried items, fat content alters. So we rather go for healthy fats. Avocados are suggested, or low dosage of olive oil is allowed. And tea, coffee is usually eliminated in the diet. So herbal teas like floral teas or chamomile teas, these can be suggested. In non-veg sources, mostly egg whites or less spiced chickens or lean cuts of chicken and fish is suggested instead of red meat. Talking of the practical strategies, since I have already mentioned to avoid the trigger foods like coffee, wine, fast food, and all the other, we spoke about increasing the alkaline fruits and the fiber based vegetables. Also, we need to inform patients that they need to identify their triggers. They could maintain a diary if it is easier for them, because as such, there is no universal diet which is set for all patients. Every patient will have to do stepwise elimination to understand what is triggering their GERD reflux. Apart from the pharmacotherapy, apart from their physiological management, for patient specific tolerance in the diet, they will have to make trigger management and symptom relation. And the portion control is important. If patients are used to having 2 or 3 large meals in the day, we often suggest to cut down the portions and take 5 to 6 meals. Early dinner practice, or not going to bed at least 2 to 3 hours after having the meals. In a lot of patients where we see the abdominal pressure is high, we avoid tight clothing and elevated head during sleep to avoid the reflux during nighttime. Moving on, we'll talk about nutrition and liver diseases. Now, liver diseases in itself is a very vast topic. And one thing which is common across all the aspects of liver diseases is malnutrition, either on a overweight side or underweight side or depleting muscle mass. We have seen that at least 20 to 50% of the patients with either cirrhosis or long-term chronic liver diseases, they will be suffering from one or the other kind of the malnutrition. Hence, nutrition becomes a very essential part in managing that malnutrition. Again, it's important for symptoms like fluid retention, to take care of the ascites. Also, it helps in improving the liver's function or dealing the progression of the diseases. Most of the time, patients with chronic liver diseases would have reduced intake due to their symptoms. They are in a catabolic state, so their requirements would be quite high. And a lot of times, the protein metabolism is altered. Your malnutrition and sarcopenia both would be directly related to the progression of the disease, and it will be causing adverse clinical outcomes. So it is very important for every liver patient to be screened, to be identified in the interventional range of nutrition, and accordingly to be provided the correct nutrition. Most liver patients who are either suffering through cirrhosis or chronic liver diseases would have a higher protein requirement. Earlier, there used to be protein restrictions, but now every study has proven that there is no need for protein restriction in liver patients. Most of the guidelines recommend higher protein needs, at least 1.2 to 1.5 grams, if not more, in the current body weight. This is required to prevent the muscle wasting or the progression to sarcopenia. Most of these patients would have a higher catabolism and would need more energy. So 30 to 35 kilocalories per kg body weight is what the guidelines suggest. However, if we are talking about a practical based approach, then we usually decide the target weight upon the patient's dry weight, and then we could decide the target energy depending on the patient's current weight. If there is ascites present or if there is electrolyte imbalance, restriction of salt is advised. Along with the physician, limitations can be maintained. Most of these patients would also be on a low fat diet during the condition, or there would be limited sources of energy. So here we cannot give a lot of free sugars or a lot of free carbohydrates. Again, they cannot be put on a very high fat diet. So giving energy becomes crucial from complex carbohydrates. So most of the complex options with fiber like whole grains or natural fruits, higher fiber vegetables, these are given in larger quantities to maintain steady energy. And when we are talking about liver disease, it could either range from malnutrition in chronic patients or in cirrhotic patients, to it could lead also to the other side of the malnutrition with obesity in people with fatty liver. So a lot of approaches are used in non-alcoholic fatty liver. So there would be different dietary approaches that patients must be undergoing. They could be put on a Mediterranean or a protein rich diet, low carb diet. A lot of patients do go on keto or intermittent fasting. But again, all of these have to be under supervision. There is no universal guideline which suggests that one diet is correct for the patient. Personally, it's advised that patients go on a sustainable diet rather than short term extreme dieting. Many a time, certain nutraceuticals are of use. So, using berberine or curcumin supplements for the anti inflammation. Omega 3 provides a good anti inflammatory effect. There are good probiotics given for the digestion improvement. CoQ10 or other supplements like vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin C. Along with the regulation with the physician, these nutraceuticals can be a part of treatment in liver diseases. Recent innovations in these functional foods and nutraceuticals, they suggest that vitamins, whole grain approach to whole grains and high fiber diet, synbiotics, which is either pre and probiotics, good quality carbs, good high fat, good quality of fats, good quality of proteins, and phenolic compounds. Combined approach will lead to inhibition or activation of key enzymes in the lipid metabolism. It regulates the inflammatory molecules. It will modulate the oxidative pathways. It will improve the microbial content in the gut and regulate the lipid transport. So, all of this pathophysiology will in turn improve the uh, liver functions. Now, depending on the condition, there would be specific recommendations. We have spoken in depth about the non-alcoholic fatty liver and the liver cirrhosis or the chronic liver. But there are certain diseases which might need a different approach, and depending on the condition, the recommendations would change. Usually, fat loss would be advised in most of the MASH or MASLD patients. Mediterranean diet has been widely used in the treatment of this. Cirrhotic patients, as we already discussed, high energy, high protein. A lot of times in NSF patients, we prioritize more of vegetables or dietary proteins over red meats to limit the ammonia production. In alcohol related diseases, we know that the uptake of thiamine is deranged, and hence thiamine and B complex supplements could be necessary. Also, we have to screen them for other micronutrient deficiencies in all the fat soluble vitamins. So, especially vitamin A, D, E, K needs to be supplemented. Okay. Since we discussed in detail about microbiome improvement, or every disease in large was kind of related to the gut flora or the gut microbiome, it definitely plays an important role. So, probiotics, which are actually the live bacteria in our stomach, they usually provide a competitive inhibitions to the pathogen. So, since it limits the growth of bad bacteria in our gut, automatically it improves the immune function. It helps in improving the digestion and metabolism. And more of the probiotics also act as a barrier in our intestinal lining. So, it improves the epithelial lining of the intestines. Most of the time, dysbiosis or altered gut flora is one or the sole cause of GI disorders. So there is moderate evidence which supports the use of probiotics in symptom reduction of IBS. And a lot of times, antibiotic associated diarrhea, probiotics are definitely useful. And a lot of times in IBD, probiotic is used as a line of treatment. Apart from these primary benefits, there have been studies which have shown that improving the gut microbiome, it leads in regulation of hormone. It helps in better production of neurotransmitters, which definitely will play a key role in regulation of the mood. So there was a review published which said that probiotic helped with patients in anxiety, depression, ASD, or other psychological issues, and it also happened to improve the memory. Another review said that the probiotics helps in reduction of blood pressure, and especially in patients who come to us with weight loss, or some NAFLD patients who need to lose weight for their symptomatic management for the liver. They also benefit from probiotic supplements because automatically the metabolism improves and their fat reduction takes place. When we talk about probiotic, we cannot eliminate prebiotic. Like we were discussing a lot of fiber, we were discussing the use of fiber in liver, the limitation of fiber in FODMAP. In most of these cases, when the fiber is limited, fiber is the prebiotic also. Like prebiotics is the non-digestible fiber which is there in the plant-based food. Now, these non-digestible fiber will act as food for your probiotics because probiotics will feed on the fibers and it will stimulate the growth of good gut microbiome, and it will also stimulate the activity of these gut microbiome. So naturally every prebiotic would be a fiber, but not necessary that every fiber acts as a prebiotic. Now, how these dietary fibers would be beneficial would be it is playing an versatile role in the digestive health. Today, we have spoken about the IBS, we have spoken about low FODMAPs, we spoke about GERD, we spoke about liver. In each of these, the fiber would play an important role. So, it acts either as a functional of a support structure. It would act as a protective agent in the liver patients. It would act as fuel source, as we discussed, prebiotic for the gut bacteria. Fibers again are of different types. Identifying the type would make it easier for us to use it in the right amount. So soluble fiber, which is usually found in the whole grains like oats or in psyllium husk or certain type of millets, the primary benefit would be that it would aid in digestion. It has gel-like forming properties. Insoluble fiber is usually found in the husk part or the peels of the vegetables and certain difficult skins. So this usually provides more bulk and increases the gut motility, and the prebiotic fiber that we have already discussed. In GERD, it usually plays a role because it speeds up the gastric emptying if insoluble fiber is provided. Motility has been improved naturally because the motility is improved, the reflux would be reduced. It provides a mechanical raft like effect where it will act like a barrier and it would limit the acid exposure, and it also binds nitric oxide, which usually reduces the LES relaxation. In liver health, it definitely reduces the systemic inflammation. Metabolic health would improve because there is a more of lipid metabolism. It helps in preventing the NAFLD. The digestion is definitely improved. It will bind to the bile acids, and hence the lipid profile would also be benefited from including a fiber in the liver diets. It acts as prebiotics. So all the SCFAs, they are all fermentable carbohydrates, and hence prebiotic would in turn reduce the inflammation. It will definitely help in microbial diversity by acting like a prebiotic. The most common beneficial bacteria would be either lactobacillus or bifido, and both of these need prebiotics for their growth. Another thing would be the esophageal microbiome regulation. Okay, so these would be some clinical guidelines and evidences that I have sourced my material from and can be useful for a review if anybody wants to read up in detail. Also, on our academic profile, we have certain books and courses. So, for dysphagia, we have certain material on the transplant, vegan rice recipes, rice protein recipes. We have different courses out there, pediatric nutrition courses live, but you all can visit the website, you all can visit the courses, and you all can get more insight on the nutritional management of these disorders once you'll visit. And thank you so much that you all have been so patient. But I have kept it short so we can have a lot more discussion. And needless, I have got to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your session. We have a couple of questions in the session. We'll take them up one by one. In the meantime, audience members, if you have any more questions, please do in the chat box on the right hand side. Dr. Purnima Rai has asked, what are phenolic compounds? Ma'am, am I audible?
Can we see the questions? Are the questions in?
Yes, yes. What are phenolic compounds is the question.
Okay. Phenolic compounds usually are found in most of the plant-based diets. They actually they are the phytochemicals which are usually present in the food. Most of these phenolic compounds act as properties like either anti-inflammatory, they give an antibiotic, depending on the different depending on the different phytochemical activities. This could be used in functional medicine.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. We have another question by Janki Chauhan. Do IBS patients need to follow the probiotics regime throughout lifetime?
For IBS patients, as we discussed the low FODMAP approach, so usually in the first two phases where we eliminate the FODMAPs completely, because most of these FODMAPs are plant-based and the fiber content is really low, we try to supplement. As in when we start reintroducing the low FODMAPs in the food, depending on how much is their FODMAP intake or depending on how sensitive they are to the triggers. If they are able to take, we can usually give them a short term course of the pre and the probiotics. And in the long term, they can depend on the food based prebiotics rather than taking supplements lifelong. And depending on their symptoms, we can do a review and keep changing the course of action.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Another question here by Alicia is, what would be the treatment for gas and bloating from kitchen, like from diet? I
So
mean.
again, a lot of times it depends on what's the cause for gas and bloating. Sometimes if just your gut is hypersensitive or if you think that there is a certain food which is triggering it, of course, most of the times the elimination of the food is the answer to it. But if you would look for a quick relief, there is no evidence-based guidelines apart from pharmacotherapy. We suggest taking more of alkaline foods. So as I had displayed in my GERD slide, usually foods like banana, avocado, ginger, or a lot of times fennel and cumin seeds are of benefit. But however, there's no proven guidelines for that.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Dr. Shashank is asking, is there any special food or diet to add for naturally control NFLD?
Yeah, definitely for NAFLD, we would like to keep the diet very rich on fibers, as we discussed, especially a combination of soluble, insoluble fiber. Completely eliminate the high fat foods or the red meats. Completely eliminate free processed sugars and processed carbohydrates. And we do give them a lot of anti inflammatory foods. We give them a lot of curcumin. We definitely do give them omega 3 supplements. We give them a lot of high protein foods from the diet. So, legumes, beans. They can be put on lean cuts of chicken as well in controlled amounts. So, usually, this diet is suggested for NAFLD patients.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Sneha is asking, what is the most probiotic contents that are high in FODMAP and dairy, and is there any supplement good for an IBS patient?
So supplement wise, as we said, we can use psyllium husk as a supplement or guar gum supplement for the fiber content. Probiotic is usually not present in active form in the plant-based foods, and if in the reintroduction phase, if most of the patients cannot tolerate lactose in itself, but lactic acid is better tolerated. So we do try to give yogurt based products in smaller quantity. So every patient would have different symptoms. If at all the lactic acid or the dairy or yogurt is well tolerated, we would use that as a probiotic content. If not, then live strain of many probiotics are nowadays being added to the plant-based products as well. So such probiotic-rich foods or plant-based yogurts can be utilized on a low FODMAP diet also.
So, thank you so much. The next question is by Dr. Jayashree Sampath. Which sprouts do we prefer in GRD?
So usually whole pulses or beans or legumes are more fermentable, and they might increase your bloating and gastric distension in the stomach. So we try and limit in active flare-ups the sprouts. If at all it is taken, we give light sprouts like moong, which is very well cooked and the water is run through, or we stick to split dals in such cases. So usually the split moong dal is lightest to be consumed.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. The next question is, do we need to completely eliminate salt in cirrhosis, or is 2 grams allowed?
2 to 3 grams is what is evidently advised in most of the clinical guidelines. However, as a clinical dietitian, we work closely with the doctors to check on their electrolyte requirements. Again, it depends on if there is a presence of ascites or not, and if there is fluid imbalance, then accordingly the quantity can be altered. But like minimum of 2 grams is usually safe to be used.
Yes, ma'am. A couple of last questions, ma'am.
Sure.
Uh, Dr. Sandeep has asked, I need an information regarding the fiber intake for GERD with bloating, and which type of fiber will help.
So, first of all, if in GRD, if you do not have indigestion like symptoms, usually you can do a combination of soluble and insoluble fiber together. You can rather first increase your intake of dietary fiber and probiotics. If that doesn't work for you in terms of supplement, you can either try psyllium husk or inulin fiber supplements.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I think one of the few last questions. How about using coconut oil instead of sunflower oil? Would that help?
For what condition are we talking? In general, if we are discussing about liver like diet, where we usually eliminate the high fat foods, normally quantity is what matters more than the type. We do prefer MCTs if there's a steatorrhea or fat malabsorption, but main restriction would be in the quantity, and we would rather suggest like 3 to 4 teaspoons, 20 ml per day, if not less.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Last question. If an IBS patient is not tolerating a particular type of dal, will there be an alternative option in making dosa or idli batter?
Yeah, so definitely if the patient is not tolerating a particular dal, we give them other options. If at all beans, legumes, or pulses in itself are a problem, we usually use alternatives like oats or quinoa to make the batter. In dals also, other dals like masoor or any other split dals can be used, like green moong dal or something.
Okay. I think, ma'am, that brings us to the end of our presentation and the Q&A session. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us today. And thank you so much for our audience members to joining us and participating actively in today's session.